We have finally landed on the topic of immigration. I think I mentioned in my introductory video to you that I consider myself an immigration scholar. I've specialized in race, ethnicity, and immigration, and I myself am a first generation immigrant to the US. So there are a bunch of readings that I've assigned to you for this particular section. And we will start off with getting an overview of immigration to the US and then go deeper into the topics of xenophobia or nativism is the terminology that's used in the literature, and then talk about Islamophobia as well. So one of the readings that I assigned to you was actually a review of the book Impossible Subjects by Nye, right? And this is an award-winning book, and I realized that we have limited time, so I assigned just the review. At some point, hopefully you will have a chance to read the whole book. But in Impossible Subjects, Nye is really shifting the narrative. So just to back up a little, we always say that the United States is a nation of immigrants, right? And at the same time, we have always been anti-immigrant, and that too in very racialized ways, right? So when we talk about race relations in the US, of course, we talk about our history of enslaving folks and then Jim Crow laws that were implemented. But the other important factor that we need to consider when we consider race relations is indeed immigration. And in the US, largely historians of immigration point out that the immigration happened in two major waves, right? So in the first wave of immigration that's largely happening towards the end of the 19th century, beginning part of the 20th century. Already, even before this large-scale first wave, you'll find that there are restrictive policies put into place in 1885 to prevent Chinese and then later Japanese immigration. In 1924, you see the Johnson-Reed Act that's implemented that in many ways brings an end to that first wave of migration, right? And then you have a 60-year window when we've shrunk immigration to the US down to a trickle. So turn of the century, America saw a lot of immigrants from Europe, right? In that first wave of migration, we're also seeing immigrants from Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, a lot of Irish, Italian, Jewish immigrants, Slav immigrants, and so on. And in our race section, I had mentioned to you that turn of the century, a hierarchy existed, in fact, within the so-called Caucasian races, right? Where a lot of these newly immigrant groups, such as the Italians, Irish, the Jewish, were ranked much lower in that hierarchy within the Caucasian group. And then so 1924 to 65, you see that there are a lot of nativist or anti-immigrant groups that are active. One of the most successful groups is the anti-Asian group called the Asian Exclusion group, right? And they are very active in San Francisco. And the whole idea is you want to limit Chinese immigrants, you want to limit Indian immigrants who were all present here, turn of the century, working in the lumber industry. The Chinese built the railroads, right? And the idea is that they're not authentic Americans. Their culture is too distinct and they are going to lead to the ruin of the nation. And you see terms that we'll look at later called the yellow peril or the tide of turbans, referring to Sikh immigrants from India, as this sort of alarmist rhetoric, right? And it's effective because indeed you see immigration becoming very limited, right, based on quotas and so on. It's really important to point that out because right from the foundation of the nation, you see this sense of white entitlement to resources in the US and especially as we expand towards the West, right? We call it the frontier philosophy, the inevitability of westward expansion, right? And it changes the whole racial makeup of the nation, right? Now, we see communists and other political radicals included in that exclusion in 1952. We often refer to this era as the McCarthyian witch hunt era when we're in Cold War with the Soviet Union. And then by 1965, we see the Hart-Celler Act implemented, right? Which liberalizes racial and national restrictions, but retains a lot of the numerical limits, the quotas on different nations. What's important about 1965 is that it is now opening up the second wave of migration, right? And the second wave now consists immigrants of color. So whereas the first wave had immigrants primarily from European nations, the second wave now sees immigrants from Latin America, Asia, Africa, and so on, right? And we open up immigration in a very selective manner. Remember that we are in Cold War with Soviet Union during this era, and we have entered the arms race and the space race, right? So we open it up to bring in immigrants who are scientists, engineers, doctors, and so on, right? And that is such an important part of history you need to look at to understand contemporary stereotypes about model minorities. Folks who are seen as inherently great techies, good at math, science, are in fact a product of particular kinds of immigration policies. And you fast forward more to, say, the 1990s, you see the family reunification laws enacted. And this means that our pool of immigrants now become more diversified in terms of social class background. And then 9/11 happens, right? 2001. And post 9/11, you see a sort of blurring happening between immigration policies and national security, right? And there's an amplification of the xenophobic rhetoric. So this kind of shows you the immigration waves on the right side, the image. It's really important to acknowledge that for a nation of immigrants and immigration, the US adjusts its immigration policies only rarely, right? Largely because this is a highly controversial issue, right? It's very divisive. And what we find is that, again, in that first wave, as I was saying, 1880 to 1930, there are 27 million new immigrants that come from Italy, Germany, Eastern Europe, Russia, Britain, Canada, Ireland, and Sweden. And then it slows down to a trickle until we repeal the national origins quota system in 1965. And today, the US foreign-born population is 13% of our population. And more than 18 million of that population are naturalized citizens. 11 million are legal, permanent, or temporary residents. And about 11 million, according to the Pew numbers, are here without documents, right? Now, what's interesting is if you compare that, right, to the foreign-born population between 1890 and 1910, it's actually lower today, right? So it used to be 15% of the population was foreign-born, and today it's 13%. And I always like to point this out again as evidence against the alarmist rhetoric that our nation's changing, that somehow we have a lot to be concerned about because too much of our nation is becoming an immigrant population, etc. There are several different stereotypes, right, about immigrants, and amplified especially during the Trump administration. Immigrants are essentially the scapegoat for a lot of social problems and issues in our society, especially undocumented immigrants. Because when you think about it strategically, politicians don't necessarily have to worry about this group. In fact, they blame all issues on this group because this is a non-voting population, right? So we like to blame environmental issues, poverty, unemployment, crime, everything on undocumented immigrants, right? But as Nai was already pointing out to you, we should be debating and discussing the very labels of legal versus illegal, right? Because the moment you designate a group illegal, you are criminalizing that group, right? And Nai is pointing out that immigration policies had a lot to do with who got to be on the other side of the line in terms of legality, right? There were immigrants who had been working on American soil for a long while. And as the laws changed, their status suddenly became illegal, right? And so it becomes very much an ethical argument as well. We keep asserting that no human being is illegal, right? So we always argue in favor of using the term undocumented rather than illegal. And then we try to use data and evidence again to argue against some of these stereotypes. One of the common assertions made by many legal immigrants, by the way, right? Folks who have the privilege to have documents and legal status, who posed the question, why not get in line? Why don't these folks get in line? I waited my turn, right? I did the right thing, came in the right way, okay? I think, again, when we have certain kinds of privilege, we take it for granted and we don't exactly know how difficult it is for certain groups to get documentation. Typically, it takes years for an immigration application to be processed, right? Sometimes the fees associated with that are unaffordable by many. And very importantly, we have a hierarchy, right, where we look at worthy versus so-called unworthy immigrants. And much lower numbers of visas are granted to so-called low-skilled workers, right? So this is where the irony lies, which is our economy needs these workers, right? So the folks who take care of our sick and elderly, take care of our children, work in our restaurants, clean our yards, our economy would come to a standstill without this subterranean labor force. Folks who are seen as dispensable, right? Use and throw. Our attitude in the US, and I'm implicating all of us in this, has been largely we want your labor, right? We want the best deals possible, but we don't want your lives, right? We want your labor, but the fact that you might have families with children who need to go to school, or you might require health care.